Okay. Whether the marketplace of ideas exists will not affect democracy. And the reason for that is because people will come together to figure out a power structure to dictate big decisions in our lives anyway. The marketplace of ideas exclusively assigns values to ideas. On both sides, people will have their own opinion. The difference is that on opposition, people will defer to the opinion of the majority as correct and subvert that of their own. On government, I think people will retain their judgment that they ought to remain unpersuaded insofar as they are not, and that their personal ideas is in fact the right one, and that they ought to try to continue to protect that idea. The marketplace of ideas require two prerequisite conditions in order to operate optimally, both of which I think are false most of the time. The first is that ideas are in fact engaged with and culled, i.e. people actively weigh up whether it's the case that ideas are good or bad. This is entirely speculative because a lot of the time what people do is that they evaluate ideas as to whether it's the case that it benefits themselves or it correlates to their own existing values. But it's a subjective metric that does not objectively clarify as to which ideas are likely to be one that are good. The second is that the discourse is in fact transparent and fair. This is probably found in nowhere in the world because oftentimes power institutions also control the media and therefore the information that people receive. So for example, if it's the case that you live in a dictatorship, then you likely are more amending to ideas regarding conservatism. If it's the case that you live in liberal democracies or you study in a college, US college, and more amenable to ideas of liberalism, etc. The end point here is that the majority or produced opinion of the marketplace is oftentimes not reflective of whether it's the case that ideas are superior, but rather whether it's the case that it reflects the interest of the majority or the tyranny that controls the media apparatus. The singular difference is this. On opposition, there is justification given to these consensus ideas. On outside the house, I think people will say that agency and propensity for us to fight against these things. Why is it the case, and what does the assertion of commonly placed ideas based on majoritarian beliefs look like? It looks like, for example, the common acceptance of unfettered capitalism, that in fact there is trickle down, even though we actually do not know how that takes place. We only assume the fact that people have seen through this and sufficient people have vetted this idea and therefore it is true, and therefore we ought to pursue, for example, capitalistic pursuits or choose to live within a society that endorses capitalism. It looks like, for example, the assertion of nationalism upon nation states divided upon different people of religion and ethnicity. We think that because of the fact that most people want to choose to live in these places, therefore we ought to be able to potentially do so as well. Therefore, we support our own intrusion of, for example, the desire towards independence or separatism, etc. The reason why this happens a lot of the time is because there's oftentimes drastic power asymmetry between the institution against the state individual regarding their propensity to empower their own ideas. This is for potentially two reasons. The first is the lack of representation. I think insofar as individuals have to weigh up ideas, the propensity for them to see these ideas held by others is something that is vital for them to accurately produce and form the empathy as to whether it's the case that these ideas are valuable. But a lot of the time, insofar as you default to the notion that oftentimes majority ideas are like white ones, it's also likely to be the case that majority ideas also be most represented. So this looks like, for example, the way by which you form ideas regarding gender norms, regarding how is it the case that you ought to form relationships with different people within your society, regarding like how your relationship between your parents and yourself, for example. The second is that the resistance of these power structures make it so that the individual oftentimes doubt their own thoughts and their own agendas. Insofar as, for example, minorities have to lobby politicians and other power institutions to get, for example, affirmative actions. The pushback from these institutions and the perception of the pushback from the rest of society makes it so they're less likely to be inclined to pursue these things because they feel as though these things are not worthwhile, because they feel as though insofar as they cannot persuade others, the ideas in of itself are not likely to be valuable. The end outcome here is that I think everyone in this room today, in some way or form, give up our agency to live the life that we want. Instead, we live the life and live the ideas that we think other things are right. We take on, for example, the mental of gender roles, the perception of, for example, heterosexual relationships, the idea that we, for example, have to marry and have children and all these things in order to feel alright. I think on outside the house, people might still do these things, but the difference is that they take more time to come to these decisions and we minimally eliminate this single source of motivation as to why people make decisions, and we fundamentally condemn these motivations to be wrong. Before I go on,
do you concede that people listen less to others' ideas and therefore accept other people's ideas less than yours?
Yes, we will concede that people listen less, but that does not mean that people listen less. What that means is we think people places more emphasis on what they think ought to be be right. So it doesn't matter if the entire world thinks that something is right. Insofar as I remain unpersuaded, that idea to me is wrong. I think people, insofar as they want to come to decisions, are naturally inclined to take on the opinions of others as checks and balances, as perceptions, as increase in information for them to come to the right decision in the first place. And all these things are things that I think remain on our side as mechanisms. What is then the comparative on our end? I think the individual is oftentimes left to their own device to navigate and self-actualize their belief. I think people will still go through a process of education and contact with other ideas, but the assignment of value to that idea can only come about when you wholeheartedly believe that idea to be true. What this looks like is, for example, at the moment, a lot of people are born into religion with the faith as though that religion is correct for themselves. The model that we have on our side is that people ought to be able to enter religion as they want to feel and see for themselves and actualize the tenets of that religion, its principles and its morality, to see whether it's the case that it actually resonates with them and make them happy. The second is that the individual own assignment of values will be predicated upon, will be solely depending on whether it's the case that they are the people who are whether it's the case that they are persuaded. Why is this a good thing? The first thing I want to know is that this is the closest avenue for people to become happy. And the reason for that is because people are all different in nature. The assignment of a value onto the individual is a speculative action as to whether it's the case that this is likely the right lifestyle for that individual. The closer action there is therefore for the individual to just live life, potentially suffer, but at the end of the day, come to accept the notion that the way in which they believe they ought to be happy is the one that is true, because it doesn't matter then what the rest of society says. And note that insofar as on both sides of the house, people are likely to self-actualize by asserting their opinion upon others. This is a vital mechanism of protection. What that means is that insofar as you can achieve that peace and wholeheartedly believe to yourself that the way of life that you live is just, you are able to be happy regardless of the amount of how structures against you. The second is that insofar as life is full of suffering, we legitimize that suffering because this suffering is self-inflicting. The individual take on this suffering as they try to become happy. On your side of the house, numerous people are harmed just because of the fact that there are various opinions regarding how people ought to live their lives. People suffer in between because they don't have the power to fight back against all these structures, and therefore that happiness is fundamentally injustice. For all these reasons, please start with opening government.
Thank the speaker for their speech. May I invite the leader of opposition.
Few pieces of framing, right? I think it's important to note how idea marketplace actually looks like. It's not necessarily just what OG actually characterized. We actually see this something that's very prevalent in our current status quo, things like social media, Twitter, forum, public posts, which basically means that it can exist in all the conversations that you actually have with people, whether that be in real life, whether that be within other platforms. But what it also means here then, that the ideas that are likely to be there are the ideas that permeates through societies. So Tan was right when he talked about democracy and its principles, because that was the reason why we had the idea marketplace, and there's a reason to the world that we have here today. What I'm noting here is that the idea marketplace is not something that is new. It has existed, and it will then still continue, just in different forms perhaps. But I think lastly, to note why then the marketplace prevailing is still a good thing, for two reasons. The first is that it fits more individuals within scale, because individuals are always able to judge it a lot more easier, rather than having their own forums, their own platforms that are then probably regulated, right? But number two, the existence of multiple institutions are the products of these ideas actually being heard. So if OG wants to protect minorities, we have no idea how they're going to do that anyway, right? Now let's just go on to responses. I think the first thing to note here is that OG was very, very much, I think, convenient. I think this debate happens in the middle ground, so the extent of the majoritarian and its harms aren't exactly what OG characterized for a few particular things, right? I think the first is simply the principle of democracy. You can't actually attain all happiness from all individuals and all groups. What we rather have here at least is a set of people and a large amount of people who actually accept this. But B, in fact, we think, at least our side, you can say the particular beliefs or the expressions that you necessarily want to have. So if you are the worst of the minorities who are extremely discriminated, at least you have that particular platform, right? But lastly, in terms of the problem that you can't weigh out these ideas, I think the prevalence means that this is something that's very accessible for people, especially for minorities, things like the BLM movement, Me Too movement. These are particular things that people are able to talk about because there is the idea marketplace, right? But even if you were to bite the bullet and say that it's the most extreme, first I'll engage within that in my argument, but number two, we don't think it's not going to self-correct and it's already within the Infoslide as well. Lastly, I think I don't necessarily know what the counterfactual is because we question how people exactly can know. What is the extent of self-actualization that OG has to do? There's no mechanistical reasons to prove why this is true, right? So we think then the efficacy only exists at the point in which you have these particular ideas marketplace. Two arguments I'll bring in for today. The first is how the prevalence of interventionist agendas from the states are likely to exist under government's world, and the second argument of telling you why having this marketplace, irrespective of the outcome, is something that is justified. First argument then, on the prevalence of it creating interventionist states, right? I think OG, who doesn't have a counterfactual likely, and the extent of which we don't know what people can actualize, means that it's likely for them to actually fall within this particular argument, right? Framing that, we don't think how, like, for example, what government necessarily defends under government's world here is that if you regret it, you probably have things like censorship, you probably limit a lot of instances that people have in terms of the capacity to speak up, which means a state intervention device would likely exist to probably in the blanketed way say to benefit the mass, which means government still requires discourse, but that particular discourse would rather be one that perhaps is controlled. Why is then the market, like self-correcting, right? The first is that it's likely to have the demands of people coming into picture. So people will speak up about it. Things like racism or sexism affects all groups of people. In fact, in one way or another, the intersectionality of just harming an individual is something that people are likely to speak up. But the comparative that likely exists under government side is far dangerous because the state now must intervene in order for you to be able to, for example, see whether the state is a good actor or not. The problem here is number one, we question if the state is likely to be one that is a good actor anyway, but number two, we question what exactly is the incentive of the state at the point in which they limit these particular instances. That's why the marketplace is something that self-corrects. It's likely to take a lot of time, but we think in terms of issues, it's likely to be heard and one that actually is accepted by many. No, thank you. The second thing I want to note here is how we actually remove extremist ideas, and this directly engages with opening government, right? Few reasons for this. I think number one is that it's a self-correcting mechanism, so you actually have this process. Under their side as well, they probably have extremist ideas as well, but there's no place for you to actually engage in it in a healthy way, right? But which means it's likely that they would have echo chambers that are the most toxic, the most extreme, and you aren't able to actually correct these particular instances. But B, at the point in which you do not have these particular platforms, it means that you're giving power to these particular extremist ideas. That, for example, the people or the state needs to censor these particular instances because it cannot be accepted. So you give power to these particular things. But number C, it means that on our side, you're not succumb to the political or the state agendas. At the point in which you provide these particular, fundamental rights. When weighing, no thank you, we win this particular issue simply because two things. The first is that the existence of the marketplace in itself, regretting it means that you regret the progress that we have already sustained till today. But number two, we prove to you how the state intervening, which is something that's arbitrary on either side, becomes significantly reduced under our side when you actually do not regret the existence of having this idea marketplace. Okay. Close it.
How do people select a popular opinion?
So this is not listening and engaging to the things that I've already said. In terms of how they're able to self-correct, judges, please check your notes. I'm not going to waste my time there. The last argument here is to explain to you how irrespective of outcome, and this is also, by the way, engaging in a worst case scenario, why having idea marketplace is something that is already justified and one that is good. We think this is the way that you actually, the framing here is that the form of the belief that you have necessarily needs to be set, needs to be within. We think because this debate is one that is retrospective, the regret here means that you regret the prevalence that is already brought to our progression. Why is this an important thing irrespective of the outcome? 4 reasons for this, right? The first is we think voices, still regardless, needs to be heard anyway. So this is still a problem on the government side as to how you're able then to, for example, adjudicate these particular ideas. But number two, we think it will exist in a point in which the majority would have still prevailed anyway under their side as well. So you could probably be at the extreme edge of the spectrum, but you still probably require the normal majority to still be within that context as well. But number three, and most importantly, we think it requires deconstruction, and it can only happen when you have this particular marketplace. Things like forums, things like debates needs to exist when you are trying to, for example, mitigate the problems, or for example, increase the benefits and necessarily is there. But lastly, we think ideas need to be known. So that's the reason why, for example, we are not anti-vaxxers, because we know that this particular instances has already been said within multiple, marketplaces, and we've discussed about that lightly. The impact here is that I've proven to you that there is value of people knowing. There is a value of us having this particular platform, and there is a value of this marketplace. For all those reasons, it has to go through opening opposition. Thanks.
Thank the speaker for their speech. We invite the Deputy Prime Minister.
For any opposition bench to win this round, they must deal with the two things that Tan tells you from the start. Tan tells you two reasons as to why the marketplace of ideas is inherently flawed. The first is that people do not weigh up things properly because of the psyches they have, the biases they have, because of various ways in which this marketplace predominates in the status quo. The second, and more importantly, is that discourse is often not free and transparent. This is the basis of the marketplace of ideas to begin with, that people can freely state their statements and people can listen to these. We told you structural reasons from Tan as to why this doesn't happen, because people control certain systems, and more importantly, because discourse is often segmented. That's why the system of things like social media doesn't work, because oftentimes things like conservative societies or echo chambers do exist in society and do segment discourse as a result of that. Therefore, discourse isn't free and transparent, and their side cannot claim this benefit, therefore, to result in ideas being better as a result. Why do you think discourse will still happen under our side? Because likely, people who suffer and people who have opinions talk. That is the fundamental basis of something that Tan tells you. That is to say that when you go through a particular experience, or you are more individualistic and believing in your own opinions to a higher degree, that is something that predominates and something that you will then be more willing to voice out as an opinion. That's why things like, for example, solving particular very structural problems in society or very major problems will still occur insofar as problems afflict a wide variety of individuals, and all of these people come up to say that this is a problem. Now, what does Tan tell you in his speech? Tan tells you two things with regards to the access that individuals have and with regards to the scrutiny that people now have on the dominant perceptions. This is crucial because this is how we deal with the idea or the accusation we get from that there's no counterfactual. Why is it likely that people will be able to still have discourse and still listen to opinions? The fundamental problem that exists in the status quo is that people are unable to access the marketplace. Ideas that seem like inferior, ideas that are seen as inferior because they don't have sufficient uptake. So for example, minorities who don't have sufficient numerical numbers unable to access these forms in the first place. In the absence of explicitly preferencing things on the strength of an opinion based on numbers, we are likely to do two things. The first is that we are likely to question the existence of other viewpoints. That is to say, when a dominant viewpoint exists and is longer being trusted as absolute fact, we are more likely to switch towards other forms of ideas, than to a variety of perceptions. Secondly, we are more likely to express our ideas. That is the genesis of Tan's argument. That is to say that when you personally resonate with a perception, you are less willing to self-censor because a particular idea is dominant and more willing to express it as a result. As a result of both of these ideas, that people are more willing to search for ideas and people are more willing to express them. Logically, this results in a larger amount of discourse and a larger amount of expressing of opinions. Sure, it doesn't occur to the same level or the same magnitude as on opposition side, but as I've already told you, the discourse is going to be significantly more productive because of the access that individuals will have. No thank you. But even if you don't buy access, the more important part of Tan's argument is that there's a one of scrutiny. That is to say, currently there is a blind deference towards the strongest opinion for two reasons. And this manifests in two ways. The first thing is that systems gain legitimacy by claiming to be free and transparent when they are not. Secondly, populism exists. That is to say that people blindly trust in a particular perception insofar as more people buy into it, and that is a particular bad. What happens in the counterfactual? People are more willing to question and scrutinize what dominant perceptions are. And the crucial thing here is that people are more happy. That is the fundamental outcome that OG claims within this round that I think takes precedence over all else. Because even if we find all of their arguments with regards to societal change and all of that, we think that people are inherently better off because they have a resistance against dominant perceptions. They have protection against the ways in which people try to assault their own dignities and assault their own perceptions. People, no thank you, are at least happy with the fact that they believe in what they believe in, and that is what is most important. Secondly, structures no longer get away by hiding behind the veil of legitimacy. They are no longer, no thank you, no longer able to co-opt the fact that they are promoting the ideas of free discourse and promoting the ideas that these are accessible to all individuals. Now there's a greater amount of scrutiny on these structures and a greater amount of ability to question them. What is the process of change? Three things. The first thing is that there's a recognition of smaller viewpoints. There's more searching for them, as I already stated earlier on in my speech. Secondly, there's a greater clash in ideals. Rather than one being predominant, there's a greater idea of different ideals clashing one another and a variety of perceptions like predominating society rather than just one. Lastly, there's more individualistic sources. More people perceive things in their own selves and try to bring that into a public forum or public consciousness. Why does this weigh out against better opinions or efficacy? Two reasons. The first is that we help more vulnerable individuals, people who have been persecuted by the societies they exist in. They are persecuted by the fact that their opinions are just lesser or just numerically smaller. These individuals are now able to claim their destiny back and claim a degree of autonomy over their own perceptions. Secondly, there's more productive scrutiny and access. That is to say that even if you have a lower amounts of discourse, this leads to better outcomes because this scrutiny is more willing to challenge predominant assumptions. That gives you a couple of reasons. Things like unfettered capitalism, things like nationalism. It also looks, for example, the very fundamental issue that minorities can access agency in a democracy, where oftentimes the tyranny of the majority exists and governments claim that minorities could vote. They could just push their policies in. We are able to legitimize the fact that their views are structurally shut out because of the ways in which these institutions exist. There's more questioning and more willingness to embrace their perception. Before I go on, go.
So if people are that individualistic and unwilling to debate things, for example, how is people going to come together and have democracy?
Yes. So the main thing that exists here is that people first and foremost believe in their own perceptions. But as humans, perceptions are swayable. So people are able to believe in what they personally believe in, but they're also expressing their viewpoints in a public forum, willing to take in opinions from others. But even if they don't take in opinions from others, our case actualizes in the very basis that only believe in what they personally believe in. Because we think that is more important than anything else in the round. If the other side isn't able to show anything that weighs against agency, we think that this inherently wins out in the round. Now, what does OO tell you? The main thing that OO tells you is the interventionist agenda. But notice that there are assumptions here, and the main thing that OO rests upon is that the state is limiting. That isn't particularly true, because this is likely a world in which individuals with viewpoints are weighed to a higher degree, and people no longer assign dominance to the ideas that are more used or more represented. This does not have to come in the form of state censorship. More often than not, this comes to the fact that people are now more willing to express and more willing to scrutinize perceptions. That is to say, the dominant perception is now taken down by individual bottom-up action rather than state legislation. The next thing they tell you is echo chambers. But recognize that echo chambers is a factor of the current society and it's likely to happen regardless, because echo chambers are structurally a result of common opinions. Insofar as people band together over the fact that they have common opinions, they will do so regardless of what society exists. What we think is more important and what we are willing to trade off here is that individual opinions predominate. That is to say, even if you have more echo chambers, we are fine with the fact that people are willing to believe in what they believe in, and this is something that still will proceed. Therefore, at the end of the debate, notice the main benefit that's claimed by OG in this one is that there's not only a greater amount of scrutiny, which reduces oppressive structures, but there's a greater amount of individual happiness that weighs over everything else in the round. For these reasons, go OG.
I thank the speaker for that speech. We invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition.
OG runs away from their burden and borderline crosses the house, where they try to argue for the benefits of discussion while running away from its implications. They had to deal with a society that was less willing to listen to the ideas of others, less willing to engage in those conflicts, less willing to engage with rhetoric, and more willing to shut down other people. They could do this even with their own metric about value assigning, where the states behave symmetrically on both sides of the house. They had to contend with a world where individuals were less likely to do these kinds of things. So at the end of OG's speech, you don't get at best agency, you get only an agency argument for them. That people are best able to internalize the kinds of things that they want to, or the kinds of beliefs that they want to. And I'll take this down later. But I've got a couple of auxiliary responses before I get into the main crux of the case, right? And first, let's talk about the comparative approach, because they concede that discourse is important. That's why they kind of want it on their side as well. and they concede that people listen to us. So what Raylor thinks is scrutiny is a misconflated idea of what society does. Because this isn't scrutiny. Scrutiny isn't telling other people that your ideas are worse and that my ideas are better. This isn't scrutiny. This is a selfish role where people only believe what they want to believe. So they aren't criticizing other ideas for the service of better discourse or for the service of better information. They're criticizing ideas because your thought in their world that any other idea is an attack on my personal identity, attack on me as an individual, which means you're more likely to get people who are shut out, more likely to get people who want to only engage in echo chambers because they fear every other idea that you tell them, because they say that every other idea is an attack on me, an attack on who I am as a person, right? Which means two things. Number one, you create a more selfish, unhappy, and conflict-ridden based society. A very small world that opening government wants to argue, where you only sit in your own little bubble and tell yourself at night to comfort yourself that I am right and that's all that matters. When it isn't the case, when you have to engage with others in order to see not only whether your ideas are right, but whether others have value, whether other opinions are happening. And this can only exist when you foster a society that does this. But if a sentiment is majority, and if people do feel comfortable being a part of majoritarian flow, then who is OG to tell those people that their happiness is invalid? If I feel valid by coming up with an idea, and then when people tell me I'm wrong, I'm like, okay, maybe they are right, and I follow along with the crowd, and if I derive some value of happiness from that, from knowing that I am right as well as the rest of society, then it is quite ridiculous for OG to tell me that those people are wrong to do that they are wrong to do what creates happiness for them. If they want to argue a metric of happiness, I think this fits. But secondly, and let's really contend in the idea of discourse existing, right? Maybe you still have discourse. The reason it doesn't manifest the way they claim it does is because discourse never happens in a way that's productive on their side. Because what changes in this debate, if we concede that both sides have some level of discourse, is the method in which people approach discourse. On our side of the house, you're more willing to contend with foreign ideas, more willing to listen to rhetorics of other individuals. On their side, they don't, because on their side, any other idea is an assault on myself. So why am I listening to other people? But finally, on their contention on engagement and transparency, as the problems with the democratic and the problems with the idea marketplace, and they further emphasize this when they talk about populism being problems of the idea marketplace. The very criticisms they levy are criticisms of us over democracy, but we don't see ourselves abolishing democracy. What do? We reform democracy, we work at it, and we hope that democracy becomes better with every election. We don't abolish it at the point in which there are problems, we work towards it and work towards a better society. We reform and become better, and I think that's an inherent thing that can only happen when an idea marketplace exists, which is the hope for humanity to be better, to have better, and to become better individuals. I'll deal with this more later. Stands it out. Why is Sarah's material still winning in the round? 3 reasons. Number one, she told you why intervention and censorship is a poor comparative on the side of government, right? It's ways on showing if the state intervenes on both sides of the house, why state intervention on their side becomes far worse. When the state always sees, when individuals see that you must have some censorship, when you must have some ideas that shouldn't be talked about, when ideas are seen as attack on your own identity, you want intervention to happen. That means you have skewed levels of intervention on their side of the house that exclusively becomes worse. But secondly, Sarah also argued why the marketplace is an exclusive mechanism to remove extremism. Why you weigh against things, because why this weighs is because you necessarily can't kill most ideas, because people still hold them like opening government clarifies. What you can do is platform them and take away the innate power and fear that these ideas carries. These are exclusive mechanisms that Sarah provides, and exclusive reasons why we wait. But thirdly, we also explain why this space must exist irrespective of outcome. And in ways because there's an innate value to knowing and discussing ideas, whether it does manifest in the best ways possible. These are innate things that we must do and have to do in order to make sure that ideas are platformed. It's unclear why we are censored any more than the side of government is if they want to argue that individuals self-censor. Because on your side, it's an open, explicit version of censoring. If the state doesn't do it, other people does it to other ideas. Which is censoring out of weighing becomes far less worse on our side. Before I get into my one-way material, Shireen.
In a fair and free marketplace of ideas, why aren't extremist views allowed?
No, they are allowed, but we are the only side that demechanizes and depowers the extremist views because of the mechanism that Sarah said. Like, listen to the speech, bro, please. Okay, finally. Why the marketplace of ideas is the ultimate act of trust within human nature, and is content with all of God. So let's ignore what Shireen will clearly come up in next speech and claim that I lack mechanism and lack analysis for this argument. Let's stop being robots for a second, and let's actually be human and listen to this argument. Here are 2 levels. Number one, why humanity must not be dictated by fear and cannot be ruled by it. Because if you're anti-idea marketplace, this does 2 things. Number one, either you silence the ideas that you fear, basically any idea that seems new or seems extreme to you is something that you reject wholeheartedly, or you want others to reject wholeheartedly. It's something that you do at a marketplace. Or you tell individuals like what OG wants to tell them, that you must cling closely to their ideas because those are the only definitions of your identity. You lie to people by saying there's such thing as the tyranny of majority. You tell people that the majority should never be heard and you must exist in your own bubble. When humanity is ruled by fear, both these things are born out of irrational, both these things are irrational theories born out of fear. Which is when you reject an idea marketplace and reject other ideas, you reject the idea that you create a society dictated by their passions and emotions. What they feel is right instead of what they know to be true. It's a society that only a side of government creates. But secondly, and more importantly, why the hope that mankind becomes better is a path the society must take. And note, if we accept an idea marketplace and we know of its flaws, this is the only path forward. The only method that you can sleep at night, reliably knowing the ideal marketplace exists, is to have faith in the person next to you. You have faith in the brother and sister that sit right next to you in order to become better. That means the onus then is on you as humanity to do better. We know there are bad ideas. We know there are platforms. But therefore, the only mechanism in order to make sure that we do better is if we can talk about it, and if we can discuss about it, and if we can trust each other to be better human beings. I think we'll only start opening our position to this.
Sharun also.
Huh? The what? Favorite alcoholic. My mood is marked up right now.
I thank the previous speaker for the speech. May I invite the member of government here.
Opening half is an incredibly frivolous discussion about perhaps some levels of discourse and the miraculous self-corrective mechanism we get in opening opposition. I'm going to discuss what the marketplace of ideas means in a philosophical sense and explain why a moral subscription of values towards opinions is necessary for the functioning of society in the future. The first thing I want to establish is what the marketplace of ideas entails in the context of what the debate happens. Opening half misses the mark because the marketplace of ideas is not the ability for people to converse and talk, but it is a way we ascribe and assign value towards opinions and ideas that are shared in that marketplace within each other. The problem with the marketplace of ideas is it assumes every valuable opinion is of equal value or at least morally neutral. What that means is my POI to opening opposition was damning because if they say that extremism is allowed in these spaces, the marketplace of ideas necessitates that they have an equal value towards things that are pro-social or things we ascribe to be morally good. The only way opening opposition can ascertain any form of self-correction they want is to acknowledge that some ideas are better than others and we need to acknowledge that those ideas exist in society. The second thing I want to explain here is that the popularity of an idea does not mean it is a good or correct idea that we all support. The intuition pumped for this is that opinions oftentimes change over time due to things like volatility in context or the general differences in demographics in people worldwide. That is why, for instance, Nazism was a popular idea during the time of Hitler, and it's exactly why that sort of fundamental doctrine would have emerged inside of opening opposition, where all of these ideas are given the same discretion and opportunity as they want as well. That means that opening opposition's entire case necessitates the understanding that some ideas ought to be respected more. Because if they want to self-correct, you need to know what's correct, and therefore you need to understand a mechanism of assignment that is required upon them. Two reasons why opening opposition loses. The first is they actually don't explain what self-corrective mechanism happens. I know it's a dig at Wesley all the time that he never mechanizes, but he doesn't actually explain how people choose the correct opinions to want to understand in society, or the correct opinions that dictate the future progression of how people operate. The second is there's no actual weighing as to why the ability to engage in discourse is a good thing. I.e., if opening up position is true, that the reason why discourse is something they want and they want and is important because it makes your people feel safe and it leads to the better progression of history, they need to understand and outline how that progression happens and why productive discourse even manifests. That's why CG fills in the gap for them, because the marketplace of ideas necessitates that you aren't allowed to call out these individuals when you have to. Let's now talk about the moral framework and why you should ascribe moral values towards particular ideas and why the marketplace of ideas does not allow this. The marketplace of ideas is founded on the idea that the only way that a correct or a good opinion emerges is through the popularity of it or the number of people who ascribe that value or ascribe that opinion. What that means is, it doesn't matter what the actual opinion is. Insofar as the majority of people buy into that opinion or that idea, that becomes the dominant narrative or the dominant doctrine that the overall factions of society subscribe towards and becomes what those individuals feel like is correct. Look again at my example of Nazism. Under the marketplace of ideas, if the entirety of Germany believes that that is the doctrine that we ought to support, that is the one, therefore, that it becomes the most correct and dictates the future of the society on their side of the house. I know opening opposition's mechanism is they will self-correct and now lean towards democracy, but the problem then is, if it's true democracy is the better idea, they need to explain why, and it's because of the moral intuitions behind the idea of democracy over things like dictatorships or genocide. Second thing I want to discuss then is what are the likely counterfactuals you have on our side of the house? Because I agree with opening opposition that OG doesn't have a counterfactual. The absence of the marketplace of ideas means that we don't think that some ideas, that we do think some ideas are worse and better than others, that we do think some moral subscription is necessary in deciding what opinions we ought to choose over the other as well. First thing then, and how we are able to ascribe those values. But before I go on,
Yeah, who on your side gets to arbitrate what values are higher and less than this?
your mechanism still doesn't respond to opening government, because opening government says if it's true on your side, everyone has a fair share of the equal conversation. The state is a part of that as well, which means the state is able to send out messaging, and if people believe the state no matter what, because the state is powerful, you also have that sway on your side. You don't have a mechanism, you can't use a rebuttal against me. The first reason as to why some opinions are more valuable than others, and why you ought to ascribe certain higher value, is because of the source of that information. Information is not created equal, and the quality of that knowledge is also oftentimes swayed in favor of one party or the other. I'm not going to listen to Raymond about medical advice, but I'm going to listen to my doctor. But the marketplace of ideas necessitates that both individuals have an equal share in value of those opinions, just because we want to hear them out at the same time. But obviously one is better than the other intuitively, because we understand the quality of the information is better than the other as well. That's why individuals can ascribe certain values towards what they want to believe in, because they understand it has an innate moral high ground over something else as well. But the second and more reasonable approach as to why some opinions matter more is the moral value behind those opinions. The marketplace of ideas means that all ideas must be considered morally neutral and are dictated by popularity only. But there are different reasons on the comparative that you can use to ascribe moral value to those opinions. Things like, for example, utilitarianism, where you have to come to a certain consensus or decision as to what sort of opinions or stakes you want to encroach upon or approach, insofar as you have to make decisions, etc. That's why the trolley problem is really famous, and we all understand intuitively that we ought to say 5 people instead of 1, because we have moral intuitions that dictate our opinions. In the marketplace of ideas, you don't have that, insofar as you understand that these both opinions are equally morally neutral. The second moral framework we can use on our side is just natural rights and understandings of how moral values are dictated. We understand, for example, that even if someone consents to being tortured, that's something we don't want to do, because we have an innate respect towards human dignity and the human condition that informs our view of life. That's why, for example, in opening opposition, if they want to self-correct and say you can't be racist, you have to be able to say racism is bad, which you can only have absent the marketplace of ideas, where you are not fair and free, where there is a certain hierarchy of what is good and what is bad in terms of opinions that you only get on closing government. The last thing I'll suggest under this then is why this weighs over everything in opening half. The first is we provide a philosophical framework as to how you ascribe opinions, the value of opinions and ideas in the overall narrative that is necessary for opening half to function. Because if opening half relies on productive discourse, they have to explain the metrics by which you measure productivity, which is only in closing government when you use things like moral intuition or natural rights to discuss why some opinions are worse than others. Secondly, we also fill in the gaps in opening government, because they explain why we're able to scrutinize and have better productivity of discussions, but you're only able to do that when you have a marketplace that is not free and fair, where you have ascribed moral values and a series of intuitions that you understand are good for society. But lastly, opening half just doesn't understand the concept of the marketplace, because it's not that people can't converse or discourse on outside of the house. It is that there is a certain doctrine or framework that you ought come to that oftentimes leads to the progression of history favor in the future. Opening opposition says we don't have democracy, but there are other reasons why we're naturally going to come to these conclusions reasons as well. Things like people wanting to avoid harm and suffering means that they trend towards things like being pro-social and being pro-interactions. Things like the veil of ignorance and you wanting to generally create a society that's better for you and everyone else because you don't know how they're going to interact means that the trend of history progresses towards morality anyway, and is why you have to ascribe these moral values to have any semblance of society in the future.
I thank the speaker for the speech. I invite the member of opposition.
Closing government is largely out of this debate because the initial ideas that are presented at the debate stage or the forum stage might be considered equal at the start, but the bad ideas eventually get eliminated through the process of discussions, through the process of debate and competition. That's how we eliminate ideas that are bad and we keep ideas that are generally good. Shireen says that while you get to keep extremist ideas and extremist ideas proliferate throughout society, I want to point out that it's precisely through the mechanism of free market of ideas that you eliminate things like extremist ideas that tend to harm people the most. She says that while Raymond is a medical doctor, but is bad at giving medical advice, and there's an asymmetry in knowledge, that's precisely why the free market of ideas is good. Because we tell Raymond to fuck off, like his medical ideas is not something that's necessarily good or important. This is why closing government is necessarily out of the debate, because you just don't understand the Infoslide that was given to them at all. The free market of ideas isn't just like a recent phenomenon, but it emerged from a world where democracy holds prevalence right now after the downfall of numerous authoritarian governments. People demanded that every idea had to be discussed before they could get formally accepted as a good idea. The first question I want to ask is what exactly makes a good idea? Opening opposition claims that in a world without the marketplace of ideas, people will not have the ability to voice out and they will default to things like authoritarian governments. But opening government, NTU, is correct in pointing out that people will still want to voice out their own opinions and therefore there will still be debates that exist, there will still be some form of democracy. So at the point in this debate, this is probably a deadlock. The issue, but we're not point out what exactly is bad with opening government's frame. We're going to point out that at the point where individuals are more individualistic with the ideas that they have and the opinions that they hold, there is no consensus as to what makes a good idea and what makes a bad idea. Opening government says that people will still talk to one another. The problem with this is that if people are able to talk to one another and they're able to convince each other, then there's actually no change under their side because majoritarian beliefs will still be prevalent. They will still overtake what most people believe and what most people understand. Therefore, it's the case that under this frame, they actually don't get any change. Which is why it's just more likely that people don't talk to one another, people don't listen to each other, and they keep individualistic views to a greater extent. In this case, in this situation, we put to you that this is bad. Because at the point where individuals hold individualistic views and they aren't able to convince one another, there's no consensus as to what exactly makes up a good idea or not. I'm going to be clear what I'm defending. I am defending majoritarian consensus of what's good. I'm going to put to you why majoritarian beliefs are the best outcome for this debate today. The first thing I want to point out is that these aren't ideas that are compatible with each other. These are diametrically opposed ideas. That's why they get eliminated and one idea prevails over the other. This looks like ideas, for instance, like capitalism versus communism, things like socialism versus capitalism, or things like religion versus secularism. These are ideas that are diametrically opposed and cannot exist with each other. The problem, therefore, thank you, is that in a world where people aren't able to convince one another and people aren't able to debate and talk and aren't willing to talk to each other, is when we have no consensus as to what exactly is the best idea that's out there. Which means to say that you divide people onto this kind of diametric lines because you cannot accept what is true or not. Before I get to the impacts of this closing government.
If the majority of society is, for example, racist, how do you self-correct against that under your market?
The first thing I want to point out is that the majority of society will not be racist because they will recognize that that idea is something that's bad and therefore they will take out that idea in and of itself. But the second thing I want to note is that most ideas aren't clear-cut whether they are good or not. Capitalism is as a concept, right? It's something that benefits most people in society but might harm others. But the comparative is that communism is also a concept that might benefit some people but also harm others. The point I'm trying to make is that the kinds of ideas that are being discussed do not have a clear cut on as to whether or not they are good for society or whether they are bad for society. Before I continue,
people may appreciate nebulous ideas like equality, but they more often appreciate tangible ideas that favors them, like racially preferential treatment, How does the marketplace empower good ideas?
Because, as I said, you probably get rid of bad ideas. So, for instance, like the fact that we recognize that we shouldn't piss off minorities because they might cause unrest is something that's a they might cause unrest and like revolt against the state is something that people recognize as a utilitarian good. So that's how you get rid of those kinds of bad ideas. But at the point in which if people really do believe that racial politics is something that's important, we see that's fine if it's the case that it creates a more utility in society. Let's first point out what happens when people have different views and cannot reconcile those kinds of views. The first thing I want to point out is that progress in society stifles significantly because people just don't have the ability to agree and congregate on similar ideas. People cannot buy into things like capitalism. People like don't like each other, hate each other, they don't talk to each other. You know, like very simple stuff like don't talk to each other, they don't want to interact with each other, and that's generally a really, really bad thing. It means that society can't generally progress because people just generally have very different ideas and can't move forward. But importantly, note that ideas don't just start out like good. Ideas have to be built upon and have to be improved in the future. The problem is that if people constantly disagree on what exactly is a good or bad idea, we never get to the path in which we improve on existing good ideas. So for instance, we recognize right now that capitalism is a necessity, that we follow capitalism. Capitalism is the better idea out of like the comparative of communism. But right now we do things like improve onto capitalism. We try to make capitalism more equitable. But in their world, they will never try to make capitalism more equitable because they're stuck in a discussion between capitalism versus communism. That's the problem. They don't actually improve existing ideas as a whole. This is bad for those people. Second point I want to make, we think that there will be, okay, I guess I already said this, there will be more infighting that exists. But the last thing I want to note is that often, when we're talking about minority views, they are less likely to be able to be heard by the vast majority of the population. And the reason for this is that at the point in which minorities don't believe that like the free market of ideas and debate necessarily exists, it's a point where they're just less willing to speak out about their own voice because they believe that those kinds of views won't be heard. But it's only with the free marketplace of ideas that takes their voices as legitimate at the start. That's when they're more willing to voice out their opinions, and that's how you're able to change how people generally perceive these kinds of things. At the end of my speech, note this. Even if it's the case that a majoritarian acceptance of idea might not be something that's preferable, might not be the best outcome for everybody, it's still the best outcome in general compared to every other kinds of outcome that's likely to exist on their side. Especially against opening governments law, where people are stuck in constant debates and unable to come to a consensus. They cannot move past existing ideas, they can't improve on them. And worst of all, it makes it such that society can't just progress and we can't find an equitable solution for everybody. For these reasons, closing opposition.
I thank the speaker for the speech. May I invite the government whip.
I'm going to demonstrate to you this old-man's train of thought, right? They say bad ideas in society will be weeded out. Why? Because bad ideas are less popular. Then it comes back to what ideas are popular. They say good ideas become popular and bad ideas are not popular. And I do note all three speakers here have related this circular idea of thought. Every single response to Shireen's argument about why extremist views still stand in society, the response is because they're bad. Because people don't like them because they're bad. We don't define what good and bad in this situation is. This is when Shireen's extension comes in very valuably. Because Shireen tells you how people identify what is good or bad. This is when the delta in this debate happens. Because on opposition side, what determines this or what the metric is used that in your head when you decide whether idea is good or bad is whether other people agree to say to the same thing. This is particularly dangerous because of the example Shireen mentions. For example, in Nazi Germany, the majority race is iron, therefore you're inclined to believe in these kind of states just because everyone agrees with this institution, just because everyone agrees with this view, that means it automatically is much more valuable, it supersedes the moral metric, the moral framework that you have in your mind in order to make decisions. This means one, you're more likely to suppress the moral framework in your head when you try to make decisions, which is something that's uniquely harmful as shown by Shireen's speech. But I think the second thing here is that it takes on the entire premise of Ott's case. Because they can't weed out this important impact that Shireen posits to you by just saying that because it's bad, society beats it out. we frame to you that most often times these kind of atrocities, these kind of extremist racist views are things that are like this kind of articulator, are things that are likely to come from the oppression of a minority group by a majoritarian state. The problem is that when your metric is the majoritarian state, the majority of people in society, and they subscribe to these kind of views that are self-serving, that serve them because it gives them benefits, for example, or give them one up over another race that they care less about, this is when these kind of views are prevalent in society. A few things here, right? First of all, I'm going to take out the premise of OO after this. I think I've actually taken out CO's case by proving the good, bad, moral framework thing, so let's talk about OO. What does OO tell you, right? Few things here. One, Sarah says that there's more state intervention. This means that you can have more state censorship. First, I feel why there's something exclusive, they don't prove it. But second thing here, right? If the state mechanism is truly as powerful as they claim, and that so many supporters of the state, for example, lie in their societies, and that these people form the majority of the group itself, or these people are the ones that vote the state in with these kind of views, for example, that the state uses to suppress, or these are the people, these are the majority of people that form a government and a state that actively uses suppression tactics to suppress the people, then one, these kind of states are still powerful in people's eyes, people are still likely to subscribe to this narrative. But secondly, this point flips over to closing government, right? Because we prove to you that in this kind of framing, majoritarian states are even more likely to use propaganda to oppress people when people don't have that moral framework in their head to evaluate what is good and what is bad, because these kind of metrics come first. I think the third thing here I want to talk about opening opposition, right, is that the opening half actually simply just assumes that people do or don't discuss things, or like there's more or less discourse. They just assert that. What does OG tell you? They tell you that automatically you get more discourse. No mechanization given, no reason why that's true. What does OO tell you? That people have less discourse? That's what Wesley's check and balance cases is premised on, right? Because he shows you that people don't talk about things, therefore these kind of impacts about people correcting your moral framework, for example, or people curbing extremist minds don't happen. So what we need to do in CG and our contribution here is, all we need to do to bring up to this point is to prove that people are still going to speak up, people are still going to discuss things. This is really important because one, OG frames that people are still going to discuss things and you still are likely to evaluate people's opinions. They don't give a reason. The reason is because it gives you a game theoretic advantage to see what a certain point fits into your framework. It gives you an opportunity to uncover new information that gives you more benefits. How does this look like? One, if you see an unknown product on the market, you're likely to ask for someone's opinion on it. Even though you do not believe that that person's value subscribes. You do not know whether that product's value, for example, fits your home or not. You do not know whether that product, for example, will look good in your living room. However, you're still willing to listen because you do not know anything about it yet. That is when, I'll take you at 5. That is when this proves that people are still likely to listen. But I think the second thing here that proves why people are still likely to talk is that freedom of speech and the value and utility given to expression is something that's innately valuable to human beings in itself. I can't really prove this, but I think the intuition part here is just that talking to other people makes you happy. That's why we have therapists. This means that when you give someone advice, for example, on where to eat or what food is good in Malacca, these are the kind of things that make you happy as a person. What does this prove? That this proves that one, you're still likely to have people listen. Two, you're still likely to have people talk. But what changes in this debate then is how you evaluate these kind of opinions inside your own head and how you act on your next steps. This makes Shireen's extension uniquely valuable. What does Shireen tell you about before that?
The only way that your piece works is to censor bad ideas. So this means that there's no tipping point because the majority still prevails and you still require people to self-actualize, as OG actually said.
You don't need to censor bad ideas. What happens on our side is that people stigmatize bad ideas because you have a moral framework that's above popularity. What happens on your side is that when these kind of bad ideas, as you claim, are accepted by the rest of society, this becomes particularly dangerous because there is no check and balance mechanism or a moral framework as secondary to what people decide about these in their heads. Few important impacts here. I think firstly, you get less expert credibility. This looks like Raymond being able to be a doctor. This looks like conspiracy theories on Twitter, for example, spreading during the COVID-19 pandemic because people are more likely to believe that drinking hot water kills COVID-19 germs as opposed to taking proper medical advice. This is particularly dangerous in the sense where people are willing to believe these kind of things, but secondly, this diminishes experts' credibility. I think the second important impact here is that racist abuse happens much more often. Do note how Shireen framed racist abuse. The majoritarian race having the ability to decide what's good and what's bad, as characterized by this opposition team, having the ability to decide what people value in society. These two are uniquely valuable contributions to the debate and are very impactful. Let's weigh them against what all these impacts are. What does OG tell you, right? They say, even if you don't buy their shaky mechanization, they tell you, when you don't listen to other people who criticize you, you become happy. Let's buy all their impacts. Why are we still better? We think firstly, even if you're like someone who goes against conventional society norms, okay, if you're happy, that's a good thing. However, when you're a minority in these kind of situations, when you are the ones being stigmatized by narratives that Shireen proves you are extremely likely to happen in the absence of a moral framework that's important to act as a check and balance for society in these kinds of situations, it's more likely they face harm and horrors. Things like concentration camps, for example, things like discriminating narratives are extremely crucial and impactful to these kind of people. I think the second reason why Shireen's mechanism is so important is that it completely breaks the opening deadlock. You don't see any discussion of what is good and what is bad because Shireen stigmatizes that term in training. Shireen tells you what is moral and what society believes and how society evaluates what is good and bad, thus taking out and filling in the gap in mechanism that OG desperately needs.
Thank the previous speaker for the speech. May I invite the opposition whip here.
Go ahead. Can I start first?
Yeah, go ahead.
Panel, as a society, there is a need to identify which ideologies are good and bad. Because this is the basis on which we create policy, interactions, and institutions. The marketplace of ideas as an ideology uniquely places a premium on the mechanism of debate and free discussion as a means by which we determine which ideologies are good and bad. The case of opposing opposition is that this premium is important because it incentivizes the creation of infrastructure that allows for that free debate, which is why we have systems of democracy, which is why we have freedom of information and media freedom, the freedom of expression to express ideologies without persecution and forums to do so. OG suggests that the debates that happen in status quo are not perfect and are often skewed. This is true, but our case in CO is that this improves as a result of the marketplace of ideologies. The point is that the marketplace of ideas is an aspirational ideology whose existence is why we have evolved to the society we are today. That's why we've evolved from a system of dictatorships and monarchies, for example, to a system of free democracy. Because we recognize that as a result of this premium, that freedom of expression and freedom of information was actually important. So, and that's why we see society improving even now. That's why we have a premium place things like the Arab Spring, for example, and democratic revolutions, is because as a society we are convinced that the ability to have free discussions is actually paramount for our survival. This means that OG's problem of debates being non-ideal is at best a short-term problem. Because in the past there were no debates at all, we've evolved to the point where we have less than ideal debates. Continuing on this trajectory leads to an improvement of this situation, and the marketplace of ideologies uniquely creates the incentives for that improvement to happen and for that infrastructure to be created. This takes out OG because their problem is very short-lived. No, thank you. How then do we beat CG? And we beat CG based on our second extension. Because CG's problem is that we are giving equal value to all ideologies. But notice that uniquely in the marketplace of ideologies, we only give equal moral value to all ideologies in the very beginning, at the very start of a debate. In the same way that you, panel, would have had to give both sides of this debate equal moral value and not prejudge. All the metrics that Shireen talks about are ways in which society debates the ideology that's being debated, right? So during the debate, we question things like the source and the credibility of the source of the information. We question things like the utilitarian metrics and the natural rights that happen. All the metrics that they talk about is the way in which debates happen. And it is after that debate that we then ascribe the moral good or moral bad value to the ideology. The problem with CG, however, is that they have no counterfactual. Because absent these kinds of debates, it's not clear who is going to be the one questioning that source of the information. It's not clear how you're going to weigh different competing moral frameworks, for example, to decide which ideology is good or bad, and that's why they lose. How do we actually flip this? This is Wayne's second extension. The way we actually flip CG is that giving all ideologies equal weight at the start of a debate is particularly important for social progression. Because in the alternative, people default to judging ideologies based on, for example, inertia. So you give more weight to ideologies that have been around for longer. You give more weight to ideologies presented by individuals who you believe have more credibility, which often as a result of structural biases are often people from the majority, which means you often discriminate against ideas presented by minority communities. On our side of the house, ideas presented by minorities, for example, or novel ideas, get a fair shot at discussion. They are not prejudged because everybody's ideology has equal value at the start. Which means that there's an opportunity for minorities to actually voice their concerns and to actually use logic and their stories to convince society about minority experiences, which is the prerequisite to create either A, change, or at the very least catharsis for minorities, by being able to voice their stories. The alternative is that these individuals are shut down at the point at which their ideology is pre-assigned a negative value as a result of structural biases that are unwilling to give them a fair shot. The second thing, however, is also that the marketplace of ideas uniquely empowers minorities to speak out because they believe that they are going to get a fair hearing. The alternative is that they feel powerless and disillusioned at the point at which they believe that society is not fair. So even if it's true that the marketplace of ideas and free debate is not real, it's important that minorities believe it is real because that is when they feel empowered to voice out because they believe they'll get a fair shot. The alternative is there's no change, no catharsis, and worse mental health for these individuals. So moving on,
In your side, the best idea is the most popular one. Why do people believe for a second to listen to an unpopular idea from a minority?
For the simple reason that the popularity happens at the end of a debate. So if you think about how debates work, right? We present ideologies, we debate them, and popularity is determined based on how many people buy into the arguments that are presented during that debate. So if the ideology cannot be articulated well and fewer people buy into it, then it's a bad ideology. I think that's okay. Alright, let's talk about why we weigh over opening opposition. Because opening opposition tells you two things. The first they tell you is that the alternative to marketplace of ideologies is state intervention and censorship. What they are missing, however, is the counterfactual. The crucial mechanism for why people actually rise up against censorship is the premium placed on debate that happens as a result of the marketplace of ideologies, which is the unique counterfactual that counteracts state intervention and censorship that we give you from CO. The second thing they tell you is that we remove extremist ideologies. But the mechanism by which you do that is by creating the infrastructure and the forums and the information that's necessary to have the debates in the first place, which only again happens as a result of the marketplace of ideologies, which is again what uniquely presented in CO. So all the mechanisms that are required for any of OO's impacts to actually activate come in CO, and additionally we also give you an additional impact about social progress and minorities' ability to create change on our side. The final thing I want to deal with is OG, because OG's claim is that as a result of this, people accept majority opinions uncritically. But here's the problem. If the majority of society holds a particular ideology, the majority is not going to scrutinize themselves because they presumably believe in that ideology, right? Which means presumably it's the minority in society who don't believe that ideology that's going to be in charge of scrutinizing the majority's ideology. The problem is there is no delta here because it's not clear why the majority is going to change their mind as a result of minority scrutiny. Minorities don't have the power, for example, as a result of democratic systems to actually implement change as a result of that scrutiny. So on both sides of the house, minorities are probably going to have to go along with the ideology of the majority. But at least on our side of the house, they get some solace in the belief that this ideology is a good ideology. So it might not be, but if minorities believe it is good, if minorities believe that it was arrived at through proper discourse and consideration of everybody's feelings, they might get some solace that somebody is not out to fuck them over actively, but they're just a victim of circumstance, which both are, but it's some happiness, right? The point is, this is still better for minorities. We're proud of this.
That concludes MDO 2024 finals, and thank everyone for their speeches. Cross the floor and shake hands. Thank you all.